Hello, good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to everyone who is joining today's Ask WHO session, which will be focused on COVID-19 vaccines. And I'm very pleased to be joined by our Chief Scientist, Dr. Swaminathan, and our Director for Immunization, Vaccines, and Biologicals, Dr. Kate O'Brien. I'm sure you know them well, both. They've been with us on many occasions. So today, again, we will focus on COVID vaccines, their effectiveness and concerns that you have. So please ask your questions. If you're watching us on Twitter, use the hashtag AskWHO. If you're watching us on other platforms, we will monitor your questions through comment section. Good afternoon, Dr. Soumya and Dr. Kate. Thank you for your time to join us today. It's been now 8 months since COVID vaccines are being used around the world. So can you tell us how vaccination efforts have impacted the overall COVID-19 response?
Sure, I'm happy to take a stab at that, and I'm sure Soumya will have some things to add as well. So we have over 5 billion doses of vaccine that have been deployed around the world. And just to give that, that sounds like a lot of doses, and it is a lot of doses. You know, there's upwards of almost 8 billion people in the world, and on an annual basis, the whole of the vaccine programs in every country for all of the different vaccines that are deployed is about 4 billion doses, somewhere towards 5 billion doses. So this is a really good amount of vaccine against COVID that's been deployed. And in the countries that are using vaccine a lot, what we're really seeing is just a complete impact on the severe disease, hospitalizations, and really almost cessation of deaths from COVID-19 among people who are vaccinated. So this is a really good news story. This is the incredible news about the vaccines, that they really work. We knew that from the clinical trials, but in the countries that are deploying at high levels now, the data that are coming out is showing that they're performing really well against severe disease, which is really the target of what these vaccines are designed to do. And so especially on protecting healthcare systems so that hospitals and ICUs are not overwhelmed with people who are coming in with severe COVID disease.
Thank you so much, Kate. Dr. Soumya, what are your thoughts on the effectiveness of vaccinations in the response?
You know, early in 2020, the WHO put out what we call the target product profile for a vaccine. And we said anything above 50% efficacy would be acceptable, and a safety profile as well. So our expectations were exceeded because we have so many vaccines that are both safe and effective, and some of them, of course, using these new platforms. And we never expected that we would get vaccines with above 90% efficacy, and we have several in that group. So I think, the science has been great at developing vaccines, and there are many more in the pipeline. There are still clinical trials going on. There are nasal vaccines, there are intradermal vaccines, there are oral vaccines. So it's possible that in the next year or so that we'll have an even greater variety of vaccines to choose from. So that's been very encouraging. As Kate said, so far what we've seen in countries which have started vaccination programs is that those people who've received a full course of vaccines have a huge degree of protection from severe disease and getting hospitalized and dying. And this has been seen in country after country. So I think it's one of the best tools we have. It's not the only tool. Vaccines have to be used hand in hand with other public health measures like masking and avoiding crowds and making sure there's good ventilation. All of those things are still important because the virus is still there, and vaccines are not going to stop you from getting infected 100%. They'll stop you from getting sick, but you can still get infected. You can still pass the virus on, and particularly with these new variants like Delta, we know that the chances of getting infected, even if you're vaccinated, are significant. So the message is vaccines are a fantastic tool. They will prevent severe disease from this virus. We need to get everyone vaccinated, everyone eligible vaccinated as soon as possible. So, WHO, Dr. Tedros has these targets of 10% of every country's population by the end of September, 40% by the end of the year, we should be able to stop deaths. That's our first priority. And then, of course, till then, until the whole world is vaccinated, we need to continue to doing all of those things that we've got used to doing over the last 20 months or so, Alex.
Thank you so much, Dr. Soumya. WHO has approved or granted 8 COVID-19 vaccines so far with emergency use listing. So a few of our viewers are already asking what are the vaccines that are approved by WHO and what are the others in the review. And also many are asking about side effects that we know so far about the vaccine. So maybe we can start with reminding them of which vaccines are on the emergency use listing, and then what we know about their side effects so far.
Sure. So the vaccines that have emergency use listing from WHO are the Pfizer vaccine, the Moderna vaccine. Those are both mRNA vaccines. In addition to that is the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is what's called an adenoviral vaccine. And it's produced by a number of different companies. In particular, it's produced by the Serum Institute of India, and it's produced by AstraZeneca itself. So those are 2 of the EULs. Apart from those 4, there's the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is the only vaccine that is a single-dose vaccine at this point. And then the additional 2 are the Sinopharm and the Sinovac vaccines, and those 2 are inactivated vaccines. So those are the 8 that have WHO emergency use listing. However, there are a large number of other vaccines that are in the process of their application to WHO for consideration of whether they meet the standards for being emergency use listed. And we have on our website a full list of what all of those products are and the stage at which they're in consideration. I think the thing that our viewers need to understand is that it's really up to a manufacturer to come to WHO with an application. We will consider any application from a manufacturer if they meet the criteria for submitting an application. And then there's an interaction with the manufacturer to look carefully at the data that they have on the safety of their product, the efficacy of their product, and also on the quality of manufacturing and the consistency of manufacturing. And those are the 3 major criteria that allow WHO, with its external experts, to assess each of the vaccines and assess whether or not they meet the criteria for being WHO emergency use listed. So those are the list of the products.
Thank you so much. Dr. Soumya, maybe you can take the second part of the question on what we know so far about those 8 vaccines and what are the side effects that people who receive them may have.
Yes, it's important to address that because, as we know, vaccines are incredibly safe products. And in fact, when a vaccine is given emergency use listing by WHO or by other regulatory authorities, one of the main things they look at is the safety profile. Of course, the efficacy is important, but safety is equally, if not more important. And then vaccines get rolled out. And of course, in clinical trials, we give it to 10, 20, 30,000 people. It's when the vaccines are rolled out, of course, now they're given to millions of people. And so what happens is that you start sometimes picking up very, very rare side effects that were not observed in the clinical trials. And so as these vaccines have been rolled out, there have been reports coming in of different kinds of side effects. Most of them are common, they're mild, they are things like pain at the injection site, some fever or headache or feeling of weakness, not feeling really, feeling tired. This lasts for about 24 to 48 hours and it resolves. Sometimes you have to take an antipyretic or a paracetamol, sometimes you don't need to, and you get better. Then, of course, there are the serious side effects, which are very rare, but when they occur, they're serious. They need sometimes hospitalization and specialist treatment. And here we've got reports for the different types of vaccines. And what regulatory authorities do is to look at the reports to try to see whether they could be related at all to the vaccine. And if they think it could be related, they then put out an advisory so that doctors and individuals are aware of this. WHO does the same thing. We have a global advisory committee on vaccine safety that's tracking these reports coming from different countries and making the recommendations. So far, we have not had any vaccine that's being deployed that's had such a poor safety profile that we've had to say, look, the benefits do not outweigh the risks. So what I'm trying to say is that all of the vaccines that we've approved so far, the benefits of giving the vaccine clearly outweigh the risks. What are those risks? As I said, mild symptoms, fine. The more severe things with the adenoviral vector platforms like the AstraZeneca vaccine and the J&J vaccine, we have noticed that you can sometimes have clotting disorder, clotting which can occur very rarely in the brain, it can occur in the abdominal organs. This is serious. People need to be admitted. It can be treated. We have recommendations on how to treat this side effect, and it occurs in about 2 or 4 times cases per 500,000 sometimes. It depends. It's the reports from different parts of the world, but it's in that range, so it's rare. Then we have the myocarditis. That's an inflammation of the heart. That's been reported after Pfizer vaccine, after the mRNA vaccine, mainly after the second dose, and mainly it's been seen in young men 18 to 30 years of age. Again, it's very rare. It's a few cases per million, and almost all of those cases have been reversible. None of them have resulted in death. And so these are 2 examples. You also have very rare autoimmune disorders like it's called Guillain-Barré syndrome, where you can get weakness or paralysis in the legs. Again, it's reversible. But the important thing to note here is that these things happen a couple of times in 1 million people vaccinated. Whereas if the same million people did not take the vaccine and were exposed to COVID, you would get much, much more higher rates of death and severe complications from the COVID. So the vaccines are preventing all of that, but very rarely you can have a serious side event. And I think as we are using more vaccines, we are learning more, and we're getting more and more comfortable with the safety profile of most of these vaccines.
Thank you so much. As we were talking about side effects, I'll pass a few questions in one, maybe summarized, as a few viewers are asking about safety of vaccine in relation to pregnancy or in general reproductive health and fertility. So what do we know so far about vaccines? Can they have any impact on reproductive health, and are they safe for pregnant women?
So at the very beginning, when we had these vaccines, we didn't have a lot of information about the vaccines in pregnant women. We do have evidence now about these vaccines. The first thing to say is I really want to emphasize at the outset that we are very clear now in the evidence that pregnant women are at high risk of serious outcomes from COVID disease by virtue of the fact that they're pregnant. And so women who are pregnant now are part of the group that we recommend as one of the highest priority groups for getting vaccinated to protect their own health and, of course, to protect their baby that they're pregnant with. So this is one of the most important points, is that pregnant women really need to get vaccinated. And we've seen in the media and in other reports, tragic reports of women who were pregnant, who were not vaccinated, who developed COVID and died from COVID, with the delivery of their baby and the loss of the mother. So this is really important to contextualize vaccination and pregnancy. So what would be best, and I think many women would feel comfortable with, is get vaccinated before you're pregnant if that's something that you're planning to do. But if you're pregnant, it is safe to get vaccinated. We now do have evidence around women who are pregnant and received the vaccine, and there's no associations of any complications attributable to the vaccine in pregnancy. By contrast, in fact, the vaccines are preventing the serious disease consequences of COVID in pregnant women. So that's, I think, a really important message. And we also hear questions that people have about, well, is there any problem of getting vaccinated and then getting pregnant afterwards? For the vaccines, there's no vaccine that interferes with fertility or interferes with the safety of becoming pregnant. And so we have no reason to believe that that would be true of any of these vaccines either. So the really important message here is about the risk of COVID disease in pregnancy, and as a result of that, really important for women to get vaccinated. We're not seeing any complications of the vaccines and pregnancy. Really, it's the other issue, which is disease and complications of the pregnancy. So I hope that answers the questions that people have.
Thank you so much. Here is a follow-up question that Dr. Soumya, maybe you can take. It's not specifically about vaccine, but as Kate mentioned, that getting COVID-19 during pregnancy for unvaccinated mother may be risky. So Fesai Abdi is asking, watching us on Facebook, what is side effect for fetus when his mother during pregnancy have a COVID-19? What do we know how this can impact the baby?
So we're learning more about this because obviously there's a lot of research going on that's trying to follow pregnant women and their infants after they're born to see what the impact of the infection is. And what we do know is that pregnant women have a higher risk of getting severe disease if they get infected with COVID. They have a higher risk of being hospitalized and dying, unfortunately. And that the babies that are born to these mothers have a higher risk of being with a lower birth weight, what we call small for low birth weight babies. And that's because probably the mother isn't, getting enough nourishment and so on. So in terms of congenital defects or, unexpected problems with the baby, we haven't seen any reports of such abnormalities in the babies that are being born. But the one fact that's been noticed is that they're often of low birth weight compared to what they
vaccination of pregnant women. Is there a recommendation in which trimester is the best to get your vaccine?
So, Alex, you cut out a little bit, but I think the question was about if you're pregnant, when should you get vaccinated? And the answer to that is that you should get vaccinated when it's your opportunity to be vaccinated. At the beginning of the pandemic and when we had the early use of the vaccines, there was more preference for becoming vaccinated a little bit later in pregnancy, while we were still fully understanding the performance of the vaccines. We really see we know a lot more about the vaccines and about pregnancy. So the opportunity to get vaccinated is really the time when you should get vaccinated. We should recognize that among people who become pregnant, having nothing to do with vaccines, but just the natural course of pregnancies, is that there are a substantial number of early pregnancy losses. That's a normal part of the sort of history of what happens among women who become pregnant. And so one of the things that I think is important for people to understand is that there are things that happen during pregnancies and to women and to their babies during pregnancy. It's not always a healthy baby that's born full term to a pregnancy. When people are getting vaccinated, there can be events where you get vaccinated and at some time after getting vaccinated, something happens to the pregnancy. Those are coincident events. It's not that there was a cause. It's not that the vaccines caused those things. So that's one of the reasons that sometimes people will recommend that waiting a little bit beyond the early part of pregnancy to get vaccinated, just to establish that the pregnancy is moving forward. But from a safety perspective and from any evidence we have, there's no problem to become vaccinated at any point during pregnancy. So really, women should become pregnant ideally before they get pregnant, but during the pregnancy they can be vaccinated during the pregnancy.
Thank you so much. We have a few questions coming around vaccines and variants, and especially as the Delta variant is taking over around the world. So are all vaccines currently approved effective against the Delta variant as well?
Maybe
so yeah, go ahead, Soumya, please.
Okay. So I'm sure Kate will add, and this is something that we're tracking, because there are also, I see questions on how long does immunity last after vaccines. This is again we've only been using vaccines from January of 2021. So we've only had a period of 8 months to study what's happening. And of course, there were some clinical trials which started in the summer of 2020. So we have data up to a year or so from those clinical trials. So it's still a short period of duration. So far, what we are seeing is that the immunity that's generated by these vaccines, which is both antibodies and T cells, is very effective at preventing severe disease, which leads you to be hospitalized or in the critical care or ending up dying. And so the severe outcomes of COVID-19 are very well protected by these vaccines. We're also looking at variants, because when these vaccines started getting introduced in countries, the Alpha variant was a predominant variant at the beginning of 2021. Now, of course, Delta is a predominant variant, and we know that Delta is much more transmissible. It's much more infectious, 2 to 3 times more infectious than the original strain of the virus. And so what we are seeing is that even in fully vaccinated people, they can get an infection with Delta if they're exposed to it. So the vaccines are not completely protecting against infection, but they're still protecting these people. Even if they get infected, they are not ending up in the hospital, even if they have risk factors, even if they are older people. So the vaccines have held up against the Delta variant. The Beta variant is the one that is actually most worrying, because it has a lot of mutations which can avoid these antibodies that are generated by the vaccines. But the Beta variant is not increasing globally. In fact, it's completely now dominated by the Delta variant, even in Southern Africa. So what we have to watch for is there any new variant that comes, which is more transmissible like Delta, which is able to become the dominant and which is able to avoid or evade the vaccines? That would be not a good situation to be in. We have to avoid that, and one of the ways to avoid it is by reducing the chances of the virus multiplying, because every time it multiplies, it can have a new mutation. So we have to vaccinate people around the world. We have to continue to follow the other precautionary measures to reduce transmission, prevent new variants from coming. But at the moment, we are confident that the vaccines are protecting against all variants. How long they will protect boosters, I think we're going to talk about that a bit later. That's something that's obviously, data still coming in. Alex, I just want to add something about Covaxin, because I see a lot of questions coming in. We talked about all the other vaccines that have received emergency use listing, and people want to know which are the vaccines that are in the process. And we have received applications from a number of other manufacturers, including Bharat Biotech for Covaxin, including Novavax. Initial submissions, initial discussions have started. There's been discussions with the Sputnik vaccine manufacturers and a few others who are earlier, not yet close to completing their clinical trials. But we encourage companies to come in quite early with a rolling submission of data. So as far as Covaxin is concerned, it's in the final stages of review. There have been, the experts have looked at the dossier. They've asked several questions around the clinical performance, the efficacy and safety. Those responses have come from Bharat. There's been another set of questions just sent to them this week around some questions around manufacturing of the vaccine. So this is normal procedure. What has happened for every vaccine in the past. There is a back and forth with the manufacturer. Experts ask questions, the company replies, and then finally it goes before a technical advisory group. And we hope that the technical advisory group will meet before the end of September and review the dossier for Covaxin and any other vaccine if the dossier is ready, and then they will make a recommendation to WHO on whether or not these vaccines should receive emergency use listing. So there is this back and forth sometimes which takes longer than expected, and I know that a lot of people are anxious, worried. They want, because of the travel restrictions that are imposed, and WHO has been telling countries not to impose travel restrictions based on vaccination status. So that's a strong position we've taken. But despite that, we know that some countries are doing it, and we are doing our best to expedite every dossier that comes to WHO. We try to move it as quickly as possible. But there is a process. We do have to look at all of the details before we can approve.
Thank you so much, Dr. Soumya, and thank you for addressing this very common question in today's live. You mentioned as well that we are seeing breakthrough infections with COVID-19 with the Delta variant, even though people are fully vaccinated. So how often this happens? A few of our viewers are asking after being vaccinated.
So again, this is a great question, and there's recent data out of the US as one example comparing the rate of infection in people who are vaccinated and the rate of infection of people who are unvaccinated, and there is a many-fold difference between the risk among people vaccinated and unvaccinated. The data are showing us that if you're fully vaccinated, the risk that you will have severe disease, as Soumya and I have been talking about, or that you'll be hospitalized, or the most serious consequence that you would die from COVID, is extremely low. But what the point we want to make is that if you're unvaccinated, depending on what's happening in your community of people continuing or not continuing those public health measures that prevent the transmission of infection, you're at very significant risk of getting infected with the virus, and if you're infected, having a serious consequence of that infection. So that's the importance that as people are being vaccinated, we continue to emphasize that it is important to continue some of those other measures that limit the transmission of the virus, especially in communities where the coverage, the amount of people, the number of people, the fraction of people who are vaccinated and who are fully vaccinated is still not at a very high level. Because if you're vaccinated, Soumya and I have been trying to continue to explain that you can still get infected. You can still be carrying the virus in your nose, in the back of your throat. You may get a mild illness. You're very, very unlikely to get serious disease, but you can pass that on to somebody else, especially somebody who's not vaccinated. They will then be at risk of severe disease. So this is why it seems confusing for people. Well, if I'm vaccinated, and if some people around me are vaccinated, why are you telling me to continue hand washing, not gathering in big crowds, if you're in an indoor space, being in a place that's well ventilated, and continuing to mask when you're in those kinds of environments? And that's the reason why. It's not that the vaccines aren't working. It's not that the vaccines aren't protecting you. But there are people out there around you who aren't protected. And we see that in many countries, even countries that have, incredible vaccine access, broadly available vaccines, that we're not at the point where enough people are getting vaccinated for their own personal protection. And then the second thing about the vaccines is they do reduce the likelihood that you will be infected. It's not 100%. And it's not as high a level of protection as the protection that Soumya was reflecting, this 90% protection, over 90% protection, or over 80% protection against severe disease. The ability of these vaccines to protect you from getting infected or from transmitting to somebody else is not nearly as high as the protection against the severe end of the disease spectrum. And so we shouldn't get confused about, are the vaccines working or are they not working? They're working beautifully. They're working exactly as the clinical trials showed that they would. High protection against serious disease, moderate or modest protection against getting infected, transmitting to somebody else. And that's the reason, while we're still in this phase of making sure that everybody gets vaccinated, it's really important to both protect yourself and in consequence protect other people from that possibility of transmission.
Thank you so much, Kate. We are receiving questions, and I think it's from Angelo watching us on LinkedIn, who is asking about WHO position on mixing and matching between 2 doses and the booster doses. But maybe we can start in explaining what is WHO current position about booster doses in general. Do we know if they are effective, or we are still looking into that?
You know, this is a really controversial area, and we know there's a lot going out in the media about this, and people are confused about it. I think, you know, I'm sure Soumya is going to want to weigh in on this also, but maybe I can just start off with a couple of comments and framing of this. The first question always should be, is it necessary to give booster doses? And we're looking very carefully at the evidence on this. And what we're most interested in is there ongoing protection from the doses that people have already received over time? Or does the amount of protection wane? Does it go down? Does it get a weaker degree of protection? And what we're seeing with the vaccines and with the variants as well is that there is very good sustaining of protection against severe disease. And it's really the severe end of the disease spectrum that is the most critical for the vaccines. It's what the vaccines were designed to protect against. So they're really holding up well over time against that severe end of the disease spectrum. The second question is, well, is there a need to get more than the 2 doses, or in the case of Johnson & Johnson, the single dose, among certain risk groups? Are there certain groups of people where the number of doses that were evaluated in the clinical trials maybe aren't performing the way they did in the general population that were studied in the clinical trials? And there's a small group of people. We are seeing some data now that people who have immunocompromising conditions perhaps would need an additional dose for their primary protection, that those doses that are working well in the general population, they may need a bit more than that, so an additional dose. We'll be looking more deeply into this and providing some recommendations on that from our strategic advisory group of experts on immunization. And the third question about boosters is really, well, okay, so maybe it's not about waning, or maybe it's not about immunocompromised people, but what about the variants? So maybe we need more doses because of the variants. And again, Soumya already answered this, that against the variants, the vaccines are holding up very well against that serious end of the disease spectrum. And so at this point, we don't see a compelling set of evidence for why booster doses would be needed in the general population of people who have been immunized. There may be some specific use cases, maybe a specific risk group like the immunocompromised, or one or another of the vaccines in a specific risk group, but we're not there yet. And then the next question is, well, do booster doses actually work? And we do see a set of research that's been done on a variety of products to evaluate, if you get a 3rd dose, do you have a very significant increase in your immune response? And it's not surprising to hear and to know that that research does show that if you've been immunized, getting another dose of vaccine does boost your immune response. From everything we know about how vaccines work, that's not a surprising piece of information. The real question is it necessary to do this? And then the final piece of information is the safety profile and the dosing profile. And so those are areas of research that are still emerging and are questions that need more evidence in order to make decisions about whether this is necessary or not. Soumya, you may have some points you'd like to add to that.
I think you've covered the question on boosters very well, and the fact that WHO is weighing the evidence very carefully to understand when will the benefits of boosters outweigh the risks, because we don't know what the risk is of a third dose and a fourth dose of the vaccine. And we also need to understand a little bit more. As I said, we're following people to see how long are they protected. Does immunity start waning? It's possible that in some people, like in the elderly or in other groups, that immunity could wane over a period of time. It could reduce, and that boosters may be needed. So, always saying at this point, let's use the vaccines that we have globally. Let's give people in all countries an opportunity to get the primary course of vaccination, their first and second doses, before we go in some countries for third and fourth doses. Because as I said before, what do we want to do now? We want to prevent deaths. We want to reduce unnecessary deaths from COVID. We have the tools, we have the vaccines. So we need to use those supplies that we have to vaccinate people who have not received vaccines. So that's another argument for waiting while we are still learning about who needs boosters, when they need boosters. The question also came about, can we combine and mix two different vaccines? This is a very interesting question, and one that's being studied now in many small studies, clinical trials across the world, because there is a feeling, there is a hypothesis from immunologists that if you use two different vaccine platforms, it could be beneficial. It could stimulate the immune system in different ways. Just like if you have a natural infection with COVID and then you take a dose of the vaccine, your immune system really gets boosted up. So it's called hybrid immunity. It's natural infection plus a vaccine, or it could be two different vaccines. But the caveat is, unless you've studied it in a proper clinical study and taken the blood from these people and studied the immune response and also looked for safety side effects, we cannot recommend these combinations without knowing everything about them. So the combination that we know something about is AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine followed by an mRNA vaccine, either Pfizer or Moderna. That combination, it's called a heterologous combination because it means two different type of vaccines. It seems to work very well in that it gives a good immune response. It's better than two doses of AstraZeneca in the study that was done. And the safety profile is also fine, it's acceptable. So in our guidance that we put out, that SAGE makes recommendations, we've said that yes, it's fine to give AstraZeneca as a first dose and Pfizer or Moderna as a second dose in some situations. But we don't have that data for other combinations, and we're looking forward to seeing more data, both on mixed vaccine studies and also on the booster studies which are going on now. And we will keep on updating our guidance as we get more information.
Thank you so much, Dr. Soumya. There was one question from someone watching us on Facebook asking, what if a new variant emerge that no vaccine is working against? Does that mean we are again at the beginning? So maybe you can explain what WHO and scientists around the world are doing already to get ahead of variants and ensure that vaccines remain safe.
So let me start off by saying that scientists think it's very unlikely that we will get a variant which is completely resistant to the vaccines that are currently being developed, because vaccines have the protein which stimulates many different types of immune responses. So hopefully that will not happen, but we have to prepare for the worst. And we also know now about some of the mutations in the spike protein which have specific properties which makes the virus more resistant to antibodies. So when we see a variant with those mutations, then we are more worried and we are looking more closely at that. So this is why the WHO has a group of experts, the Virus Evolution Working Group, which is looking very carefully, real time, at the mutations, at the virus evolution, because as you know, scientists from all over the world are uploading these whole genome sequences on platforms like GISAID. And today we have more than 3.3 million whole genome sequences on GISAID. So we have a good idea of how the virus is changing and adapting. And then we have variants of interest that we're watching carefully because they have some mutations which might be a little bit worrying. And then we have variants of concern when we can definitely know that these variants are behaving in a manner that either make them more infectious, or they make people get more sick, or they are resistant, partially less susceptible to vaccines. So these are the three properties that we like to watch. So as you know, we have 4 variants of concern that we're using Greek alphabets now to name: alpha, beta, gamma, and delta. And we have currently 5 variants of interest. The latest one is mu. There's also something called C12 that we're watching. So we will be able to track. And also vaccine developers are now have methodologies to quickly adapt their vaccines to a new variant. So, you know, we do this for influenza every year. We have a group that meets at WHO that selects the strains that go into influenza, because influenza mutates a lot more than SARS-CoV-2. So every year you need to change the vaccine a little bit to make sure that you've got the latest circulating variants in the vaccine so that it's most effective. So we've set up a similar group that's going to be tracking mutations in SARS-CoV-2 and making recommendations for vaccine developers in case they need to change the composition or the virus type that they're using for the vaccine. So it's possible to do that. It's of course takes time. There's a regulatory process to go through to get these variant adapted vaccines licensed. So we hope that it won't be necessary. So far, the regular vaccines have held up well against all the variants of concern. But this is not something we can predict. So we have to be prepared for a worst case scenario and hope that it will not happen. But again, I think our goal is vaccines plus the public health social measures. We should not believe that vaccines alone are going to get us out of this pandemic. They're an excellent tool. They're a fantastic tool. We need to use them. But for now, we also need to be very careful in our behavior. We cannot go back. We've seen in countries that have vaccinated 50, 60, 70% of people, when they open up, when people start mixing without any masks, when mass gatherings start happening, transmission goes up. And when transmission goes up, people will get sick and get hospitalized. So that's teaching us that we have to do vaccines plus all of the other things, at least for some more time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Soumya. We have a couple of minutes left, and I just want to pass one more question that we received from few viewers as well. It's about safety and recommendation of vaccination of young people and children. And in particular, as the school year has started in many parts of the world, whether WHO think that primary school children should be vaccinated.
So let me get started on that one. What we know, and again, we'll just keep reinforcing it, is that what we're most concerned about is the serious disease that occurs as a result of getting infected with SARS-CoV-2 virus. And luckily, and a little bit, perhaps not expected, is that both adolescents and school-age children and young children are at much lower risk of getting serious disease when they get infected than are older adults and other risk groups. Now, there are some conditions that even adolescents or children have that put them at risk for serious disease, and those are kids who definitely should be vaccinated. But the point of vaccinating adolescents and younger children is more about trying to reduce the amount of transmission that is occurring, trying to reduce the amount of infection that's occurring and the onward passing of that virus to other people. Now, we've already talked about the fact that these vaccines, although they do have an impact on infection and they do have an impact on transmission, it's not as great as the protection that you get against serious disease. And in a setting where we still have not enough vaccine for everybody in the world who's at most risk of having serious disease, and the vaccines haven't been deployed for all of those people who have highest risk of disease, it's not really the priority at this point to be immunizing younger people who are very much lower risk. So at this point, there are some vaccines that are authorized for use for people who are 12 years of age and older, but we don't have products that have reached the point of being authorized for use or policy recommendations for using vaccines in children under 12 years of age. That is likely to come in the future. So the trials are being done to evaluate the safety of vaccines in children and evaluate the performance of the vaccines, whether they produce the same kind of immune response and whether or not they're protecting against what is unusual, but still some disease in younger people. So we will start to see more vaccines that are authorized for use in adolescents. We'll start to see vaccines that are possibly going to be authorized for use, depending on the evidence, for children who are school-age children or maybe even younger children. But the priority for deploying the vaccines is really to get older people, health workers, all adults vaccinated, because that's really where the majority of the serious disease is occurring and is having, very significant consequences. What's really critical is that children are in school. And there are ways that children can be back in school where they're safe and the adults around them are safe. That doesn't necessarily mean having to deploy vaccines to adolescents and young children. So it's an incredible priority, a very high priority, that schools stay open and that children are in schools and not dependent on their vaccination status. And this is the reason why it really is incumbent on the adults around them to get vaccinated. Because when adults are vaccinated, the risk of a child being infected and transmitting to an adult and resulting in serious disease is so much more diminished. So these are some of the reasons why the policies and the recommendations are the way they are, which is our priority needs to be to get all of adults vaccinated around the world as quickly as possible, both so that they're protected and it's providing an environment where children can get back to their usual activities, and especially children should be in schools. Schools really shouldn't be shutting down because we have many strategies for keeping kids safe and adults safe. With vaccinations of adults, for some countries, the availability of vaccines for vaccinating adolescents, and we'll see what the evidence brings as we move forward. But there isn't at this point any authorized vaccine or a recommendation for immunizing children younger than 12 years of age.
Okay, thank you so much. Before we close, Dr. Soumya, would you like to maybe have final message to our viewers about COVID-19 vaccines and why they should get vaccinated when it's their turn?
I hope that our explanations and answering of questions has put to rest some of the questions and the doubts. We're always willing to answer more questions about vaccines because, as I said, it's incredible that we have so many safe and effective vaccines for this virus. It could have been a different situation. Not all viruses are easy to make vaccines against. Look at influenza. We do not have such highly effective vaccines for influenza. So I think it was lucky for us that it was possible to develop these vaccines. Many companies around the world have worked night and day to develop these vaccines. Scientists have worked really hard, and they're now available, and they're becoming increasingly available. We know that there's still inequity, and WHO through COVAX is really working hard to see that we can get as many supplies as possible shipped to those countries where people are still waiting to get vaccines. And this is, in fact, the sorry side of this whole story is that the science was very good. It developed the vaccines, but the global solidarity that was needed in order to have a fair and equitable distribution did not work as well. But we're still hopeful that countries that have enough supplies for their own citizens are going to share their excess supplies with COVAX, and that there will be enough manufacturing. We're working with countries to scale up manufacturing. We're trying to remove all the bottlenecks. So we're doing a lot to make vaccines available. But for those people are in countries where vaccines are available, you're eligible, please go and take the vaccines. We're seeing in countries that have 50-60% vaccination coverage that the majority of people in the hospitals today are the unvaccinated. So vaccines work, they save lives, they will allow you to go about your work and function or study much more normally than if you did not have the vaccine. And ultimately, I think vaccines are going to bring the world out of this pandemic. But everybody needs to cooperate. And of course, I have to say again, let's continue to also take the other protective measures, vaccination plus the behavior change that we've all got used to now, the masking and the distancing will help us get to that point. The WHO is working with scientists, companies, civil society, activists, other global health agencies to make sure that people around the world have access to vaccines as quickly as possible. And we're also working to make sure that more vaccines are developed. We may get even better vaccines, even more affordable vaccines in the future. And we're making sure through our SAGE scientific advisory groups that we keep on updating the evidence that we provide to people around the world who depend on WHO for sound scientific advice. Thank you, Alex.
And I also want to thank all our viewers who are watching us from Zambia, Haiti, Pakistan, Iran, Thailand, India, the US, South Africa, Vietnam, Democratic Republic of Congo, Sri Lanka, Senegal, Madagascar, Argentina, Morocco, Brazil, Philippines, Canada, France, Sweden, UK, and many others. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for watching us and following us. And until next week, please stay safe. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks all.